Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator at Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined this evening by Sara Dykman, who is the author of Bicycling with Butterflies, my 10,201-mile journey following the Monarch migration. This book is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are happy to take your order online, in person, over the phone. We offer online shipping. We offer curbside pickup and in-store browsing. And you also, I believe you sent book plates and art print for our people as well. Thank you very much to our audience members for joining us. If you would like to join in the conversation, we have a chat sidebar. Make sure that your settings are set to all panelists and attendees so your fellow audience members can see what you're contributing to our conversation. We will be answering questions later in the event, so please type your questions into the chat sidebar or the Q&A function. Sara, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, I believe we practiced. You have a presentation that requires just a little bit of tech setup. So you're going to click a couple magic buttons.
I will do
and
that.
We're going to get started.
Let's see if I can do it smoothly this time.
All right.
Just do this for an hour. Portion of the screen, share, and then we'll get that up.
There
and you should see me and a Monarch.
Yes, nice and clear.
Awesome. Great. Well, first I just want to say thanks, Elizabeth from Gibson Books and all the folks that helped put this together. It means a lot. It's really my mission is to talk about the Monarch, and so doing events like this is what my goal is. And so thanks for putting that together, and thanks everyone for tuning in and letting me take an hour of your day to talk about my story and the story of the Monarch. And really, that's what I love about the Monarch is that I keep having these moments where I'm like, wow, like the Monarch is the reason I'm doing this presentation tonight. The Monarch is the reason that I went on my bike tour. The Monarch is the reason that I have a book. I'm so excited about it. And I have to thank the Monarch every chance I get. So the presentation is about my trip. And I have to admit that at the very beginning, I honestly had no idea what it was going to be like. And part of that was I only planned the bare minimum so that I could say yes to opportunities, so that I could kind of go with the flow, if you will. And I set off not having any idea if I would see Monarchs, not having any idea if I would meet people that wanted to listen to me talk about Monarchs. And I took this picture about day 6 of my trip, and I am pretty much lost in Mexico. I had decided to take a route that everyone warned me against, and the first day was just brilliant. It was like, why did everyone say this road isn't a road to Tamaulipas? And it became evident when the road dead ended into a field, and I kind of stood there for a little bit in shock, and then flagged down a woman. And luckily in Mexico, there's always someone around to ask for directions, or almost always. And she looked at me like, where are you from and what is going on? And she said, no, of course this isn't the road to Tula, like it's a field. And so she signaled me back up the road, and she told me to take the first right. And this picture is of that first right. And I remember this moment where I was just like, what am I doing? Why am I here? And now looking back, what I love about this picture is that road led me on my entire journey. And that road actually led to a book. And so I'm so thrilled by all the turns and twists that this adventure has led me on. And the Monarchs have really made that all possible. And including they made it possible for me to pedal to New Hampshire. I always do these really silly photo shoots at every state line or every country line if they have a sign. Not because I think political boundaries are super important, but when you are on a bike tour, you celebrate everything. And you try not to think too far into the future. When I was in Mexico, I did not try to think about Canada because your mind would explode. Instead, you think about the next grocery store or the next state sign. And I have to admit, when I was in the Northeast, I felt very fast because I could pass a state every few days. I'm like, oh, this is great. It's a lot easier than crossing Texas. So I look at that picture too, and I look, there's a road in there, and those two, the two pictures that I've shown, they're connected by a series of roads and a series of people and a series of monarchs, and that's really what my trip was about, is about connection, and so I'm happy today to talk about that. And first, what I'll do is I'll start with my route map. This is a range map of the monarch butterfly overlaid with my route, and so my route is that red line, and I pedaled every single centimeter of that line. It's a 10,201 mile line. And I started in Michoacan, Mexico, which is where the monarchs overwinter. That's where you'll see them in the trees and they'll cluster together. And then in the spring, in March of 2017, I followed the mountains to Texas. And people always ask, well, how did you know where to go? Well, if you look at this range map, the monarchs are the perfect traveling companions because they spread out. And so as long as I was in Texas in the spring, I was on the route of the monarch. And you'll see that New Hampshire is yellow, and as long as I was in New Hampshire in the summer, I was on the route of the monarch. Now, I could go into like nitty-gritty science details right now, but I think the most important thing to note from this map is that the monarchs, if it was in a perfect world, they would want to just kind of fly straight north, and they would want to get and find all the milkweed, which is where historically the most milkweed was, in the upper Midwest and the kind of the Corn Belt, and then they'd fly south. But what happens often is that there's prevailing winds from the west that actually push the monarchs east. And so I heard, oh, prevailing winds push. And as a cyclist, nothing makes me happier. Nothing makes me happier than getting a tailwind. So I thought, oh, I'll take advantage of those prevailing winds too and visit the East Coast. And you'll see this loop is kind of strange. It's like, wow, what was she aiming for there? And the story, I don't even explain this in my book, is that the reason that I first did my trip, before I knew that there was this network of monarch people, before I knew that I would have no trouble finding places to go and people to visit, I had decided that I really wanted to see the monarch overwintering grounds, and I really wanted to see Rhode Island, which was the only state I hadn't biked to. So I got to bike to Rhode Island and officially biked to every state in the United States. So that was a fun celebration for me. Now, this whole route took about 8.5 months, and I want to talk a little bit about it. But people always are wondering how did you do it? And honestly, if I actually go backwards, you'll see on my bike here, the best way I can describe it is that it just took 1 mile at a time, and I had everything I needed, so I didn't have to worry too much about where I would be or what would happen. I knew things would kind of work themselves out. And in fact, because I carried everything on my bike, and it was heavy, it was like about 70 pounds, I'd say, with a lot of stuff, is that I was able to eat when I was hungry. And I would go to a grocery store about once a day, and I would buy a lot of random food depending on how hungry I was, and then fit it in my bags, and then I would just be able to go. And I wouldn't have to worry about getting to a restaurant or someone's house even, or a specific spot to have food. I knew I would be prepared. And the other thing that I knew I would always be able to do is camp. So on my bike, I carried everything I needed to camp, and I never paid to camp. I didn't really go to official campgrounds. I would just camp where I found myself, and it's kind of often hidden in plain sight. And I like this strategy because, one, it alleviates all the pressure of getting somewhere, and you really don't have to plan, and of course it's really cheap. But also it really connected me to the journey of the monarch. So the monarchs are traveling north, and they're not scheduling certain camp spots. They're not like looking at maps and figuring out where there's milkweed left. They're flying, and every night they have to find a spot. And I have to imagine that some nights it's perfect. They find everything they need. And then there's other nights where they fly and they just can't find that perfect spot. And that happened to me. I mean, I always found a place to camp, but some nights it was like on a slope where I felt like I was going to roll out of my tent all night, or it was just not very comfortable. But the nights where everything lined up, and it was always like my favorite thing that would happen is if I would find a tree that I could lean my bike against. That was always like the gem, because that meant I didn't have to all my stuff wouldn't fall out of my bike. I would be able to just put it in and take it out really easily. So a tree was like the biking equivalent of a monarch finding a patch of milkweed. Now, I get to this part of the presentation and people are like, no thanks. That doesn't sound fun. And I have two two things that I think might help make it a more appealing idea. And the first is it's really, really easy to clean a house when you live in a tent. And second of all, I actually got so much hospitality. I didn't sleep in my tent every single night of my trip. It was an 8.5 month trip, like I said, but over the course of that 8.5 months, I stayed with 68 families, often for a few nights. And what I love about this part of my trip is that the same people that were helping the Monarch were the same people inviting me in. And so again, I felt that bond with the experience of the Monarch, that real connection. And this is this is a great example. This is Margaret from Canada, and in the foreground, she's a dairy farmer, and she is feeding me chocolate ice cream that's homemade from her dairy cows, and it was delicious. And in the background, who is she feeding? Monarchs and all the other pollinators. And one thing that I think is so important to note is that when we help protect the monarch, when we talk and support and advocate for the monarch, we are talking and supporting and taking care of all of the creatures that rely on that same habitat. So Margaret is helping me and so many other creatures. And since I'm talking to folks at Gibson Books, which is in Hampshire, I thought I'd tell a few stories of connection from the Northeast. I actually only stayed a few nights in New Hampshire. I did cross the White Mountains, and I saw them in pure cloud cover. They were very white. I didn't actually see them. I'd like to return one day. But I did manage to meet some folks in the area. This is Dawn and Bruce, and I stayed with them in New York. And I don't even remember exactly how we were connected. What happens most of the time is that someone would hear about my trip and they would post something on social media, or they would tell their friends, and all of a sudden I check my email and there'd be like 5 people being like, you should come here, you should stay with me, you should do this. And I would look at the map and I would say yes to as many of those opportunities as I could. And I'm so grateful I was able to say yes to these guys, because they had an incredible spot. And not only did they invite me in, not only did they feed me, but they were also, of course, in the front yard, had a bunch of milkweed, and they were feeding the monarchs. And because I didn't have a really set in stone schedule, I got there and I was only planning, I think, to stay a night. And I just was having so much fun with them. We spent the whole day in their garage turned art studio, sculpting with clay, that when they asked, hey, do you want to stay an extra day? I said, yeah, of course I do. And I'm just really grateful for these connections. Another one is with Katie in Massachusetts, and Katie is called the Monarch Gardener, and that caught my eye when she emailed me, because it's like, of course I have to go visit the Monarch Gardener. And she invited me to her house. It was obvious which was her house. It was the one covered in native plants in the front yard. It looked so beautiful, and everything was in bloom. And one day she helped schedule a presentation for me to give the presentation about my trip. And she also scheduled this butterfly release. And she had raised this monarch from an egg in her yard, and the press came out to take a picture of it. And I love it. I love that not only is she kind of helping spread the word about my trip, but she is doing what we all need, what the monarchs need us all to be doing, which is sharing their story. And I always find it fascinating. Like, I'm in New Hampshire and people are like, you're gonna bike to Mexico? And then I see a butterfly and I'm like, yeah, and so is that butterfly. And they're like, oh, cool. But really it should be the opposite, right? Every single butterfly we see, we should be like calling all the news channels and being like, alert, alert, there is a butterfly that is going to make this incredible journey to Mexico. Or maybe their great grandma came from Mexico. And I think that the more energy we can put into the monarch and the more we can realize just how incredible they are, I think the more chance we have of saving them. Now, I also stayed with some folks in Vermont. This is called the Farm Between, and that is Nancy and the dog. And I have a picture of John as well, but that comes up in a moment. But I was also invited to come to this farm. And of course I said yes, because it was en route and I wanted to visit a farm. And this is what I found. And It was an old dairy farm that they had bought and were converting to an orchard, and these are all young apple trees. And if you look below, there was more milkweed than I had ever seen in my life. And those purple blossoms are of common milkweed. It's my favorite species. It smells so good. And I honestly could have spent the rest of the summer just crawling around in this milkweed finding things. And there was so much to find, including this fifth instar caterpillar here. And this is John, and I have this picture because he invited me to the farmer's market where he was selling snow cones, and it happened to be a cold day, but they were still a hit. And this is, I think, elderberry syrup from his farm. And so again, the people that were inviting me, John and Nancy, they were inviting me in, and at the same time they were inviting Monarchs. So again, another connection I have with the Monarch. And I'd like to pause here for a moment and actually just read a short few paragraphs about my stay with John and Nancy. And let's see, I'll flip to it. And both the Monarch in this picture will be a character in this part of the story. So here we go. Barely into Vermont and headed east once again, I arrived at John and Nancy Hayden's fruit and berry farm, the farm between. The red barn and farmhouse, which signaled me off the road, were legacies of its dairy farm history. When I arrived at the top of their winding driveway, instead of cows, I saw that a seemingly endless sea of milkweed grew from the shores of the drive. Purple blooms capped each wave as the milkweed held steady in soil that had been worked for many years. Now, allowed to do what soil wants to do, it held the roots of its native plant community. Looking at more milkweed than I had ever seen before, I wondered if the farm between had been named for its location between two quaint towns, or because here nature was permitted to thrive between the fruit trees and berry bushes. Over the next few days, I walked around the farm's lavender canvas. I gulped the air left sweet by milkweed blossoms and listened to the language of insect wings, testifying on behalf of nurtured ground. I met the young apple trees stretching in the sun and tasted huckleberries and elderberry flowers snuggling with their wilder neighbors. I drizzled a stack of Nancy's homemade pancakes with a sampling of farm fresh fruit syrups. I was another lucky migrant enjoying the bounty of the farm. If the spread of wildflowers looked like a sea from afar, wading in, I found each milkweed to be an island of habitat teeming with creatures. A googly-eyed spider peeked from a curtain of leaf. An angelic moth, satin white, floated from purple bloom to purple bloom. A fiery-legged insect, vivid from its recent molt, gained its bearings in the stubble of the milkweed's coarse white hairs. Upside down, a fifth instar monarch caterpillar straddled a milkweed's main stalk and, like a beaver, chewed at its leaf stem. I squatted down. And I'll stop there because I squatted. What the book goes on to say is that I squatted down to really take a look. And one of the things that's so incredible about the Monarch is their relationship with milkweed. And for folks that don't know, milkweed is the only food source of the monarch caterpillars. And milkweed is toxic to many herbivores. But the monarchs have actually adapted to be able to eat that toxic poison and carry it in their own bodies, making them poisonous, which is why monarchs are bright orange. They're warning predators, hey, when I was a caterpillar, I ate milkweed. You best avoid me. But the milkweed has a lot of advantages too. And if you look right here, this fifth instar caterpillar actually chewed the stem, and that stopped the latex flow so that the gluey sap that the milkweed produces to deter herbivores as well would be less intense for this caterpillar. And this was just happening in a farm. And this caterpillar wouldn't exist if it wasn't for John and Nancy's decisions. And I have to think, like, did I see this caterpillar's great-great-grandma in Mexico? Like, did this caterpillar visit someone watching today? Or did this caterpillar lay eggs in someone's garden that's watching today? And I think all of our actions affect each other, and we're all connected. And the Monarch just keeps teaching me that over and over and over again. So I kind of just actually, the Monarch's teaching me more than that. And if you look at this picture really closely, this is in the monarch colonies in Mexico, and you'll see this tree right here. It's a tiny tree, but it's actually bending from the weight of monarchs. And so I think about Don and Bruce and Margaret and Katie and John and Nancy and all the people that took care of me on my trip. And I think like one of them alone can't really help the monarchs, right? And just like one butterfly in this forest can't bend a tree, but together all these monarchs add up, and their weight literally can break branches off trees. And it's the same with our actions. And I was able to see and feel what that means to have everyone working together, and just see that when we come together, we really can do great things. And so I hope that my book inspires people to plant a garden and to be another metaphoric butterfly bending the branches of the trees. And I actually haven't planted that much milkweed, but my role, I think, in the monarch migration is to be their voice. And that's kind of what I set out to do. And so I did presentations, like I said, and I talked to about 9,000 people on my trip, mostly school kids, about adventure. And I wanted them to know that they can be part of the solution, and that they can have an adventure. And just because maybe something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it's not worth trying. And I think, again, it's the same lesson the monarchs have. The first picture, or the picture I showed you, this one here, this is when it's cold out and the monarchs hang from the branches, bending them with their weight. But as soon as the sun comes out, the monarchs will erupt into the sky, and you can close your eyes and you can hear them. And here's the thing, like, I had talked to 9,000 people. That's just the start, right? But if all of them talked to someone, and all of those people talked to someone, then there would be a lot of voices talking on behalf of the monarch. And so when you go to Mexico and you hear one monarch, or when one monarch's flying around, you can't hear it. But when 10,000 are flying around, it creates this gentle whispering song that is just so beautiful. And it's the same with us. One voice is just that one voice, but all of us together, well, that adds up to something that can't be denied. And knowing that was really what kept me going, because I have to be honest, like, a lot of times on my trip, it was really fun. And here I am, and I've just spotted this fifth instar caterpillar. I actually spotted the frass first, which is the caterpillar poo. And I was feeling pretty smug, like, yeah, I'm good at this. Like, 8,000 miles in or whatever, I can spot a caterpillar riding to 10 miles an hour on my bicycle. And this was fun. And I actually spent like probably a few hours taking pictures of this caterpillar and some other animals I was finding in the milkweed. And then just down the road, this is what I saw. And like, I have to say that, like, I got angry on this trip, and I got mad, and I got sad, and I just went and saw too much of this. And the planet is home to so many amazing creatures. And we have decided that we would rather plow it all down, tear it all down, and replace it with a grass that needs water and fertilizer and herbicides, and is literally home to, quite frankly, almost nothing. And so I would bike by this all day, and I would just be like, of course I'm not seeing monarchs. Like, look at what we've done to the planet. And like I said, I'd get angry. But the only way I was able to make it through was to meet people that were doing things different, and that were changing what we think beauty is, and we're questioning the system. And I call these encounters medicine. So this is a school garden in Omaha, and we were looking at in the milkweed in their garden, and a monarch came and visited us while we were out there. And it was so wonderful. Like, all of us, I forget how many third graders it was, and we're all pointing at the sky, we're all shouting with joy. And that monarch would not have been there without that garden. So by those kids working hard to replace this like green grass little plot in their parking lot with these milkweeds, they invited that monarch, they invited that experience. So I carried that moment with me for the rest of my trip, and today even. And some more medicine was meeting folks like Bill. He owns Native American Seed in Junction, Texas, and he started his career planting Bermuda grass as a landscaper, and was like, what are we doing? This is ridiculous. And so he started planting and growing seeds, native seeds, and now he's literally growing the seeds to replant Texas. And I stayed with lots and lots of people that, like I said, fed me and fed the monarchs. And this is an example of a garden in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is Amy's garden. And it's pretty small. And I love this because it's a great example of how we can share, right? She has a dog and some kids. And so they were able to have the grass, have a little patio there. But then there's a bunch of common milkweed in her garden. And she's in Oklahoma, and she'd already found, by the time I got there, 40 eggs, 40 monarch eggs. And so I think if only one of those eggs survived, well, that would be the opportunity for that adult to lay 500 more eggs down the line. And if only 5 or 1% of those, that's 5 more adults in Canada, possibly, each laying 500 eggs. And so the actions of one of us can affect the rest of us. And even the smallest garden can have a positive impact on the migration. Because, and I love thinking, like, what monarch would I not have seen if it hadn't been for this garden in Tulsa, Oklahoma? So thanks. And this is another of my favorite gardens. This is Nadia's garden in Columbia, Missouri. And I did not need to know the exact house that she was at, because I could bike down the road and I spotted it and I was like, that is Nadia's house. And it's full of native plants. It was a thrill to walk through. I could have spent 2 days just hanging out in her yard, discovering all the secrets. But what I love about this picture is that you can see here, there's some common milkweed. And I asked Nadia about it, and she said, well, first her neighbors mowed everything. And then her neighbors learned, by her example, probably, I don't know exactly how they learned, but they learned that milkweed is the only food source of the monarch caterpillar. So they started mowing around the milkweed. And this is how it's going to happen. It's going to take people like Nadia being an example of something different, something sustainable, something that give that monarchs a future. And then watching as that idea spreads, and watching as the milkweed spreads. You know, the milkweed is amazingly forgiving. Like, we took all of the habitat, and then we give them a little bit, and they're like, okay, sure, we forgive you, we'll grow. And wow, we should just be so grateful every day that these natives are still willing to try and grow alongside us. And it doesn't matter where you live. Like, this is the astonishing part. I saw this monarch in New York, and while I was taking pictures of this monarch in New York City, everyone else was taking pictures of buildings and I don't know what not. And it was just a great reminder that we plant these gardens, and the monarchs gift us their visits. They gift us their beauty. But often we are so busy, we might look at the garden, but we don't see all of the creatures that are at home in it. And when people always ask me, like, what is the most important thing that the monarch can do for us? Like, there's a lot of important things the monarchs do, but for me, this moment, this picture is what it is, which is the monarchs invite us back into nature. And it's so easy to fall in love with a monarch. Like, look at that. That is a beautiful butterfly. It's impossible to deny. But as you fall in love with the monarch adults, you want to know about the caterpillars. So you have to slow down and you have to look, and you'll start to find caterpillars, monarch caterpillars. And then, of course, while you're on your hands and knees digging around in the milkweed, you're going to find all the other animals that depend on milkweed, like the tussock moths. And you're going to find that's a googly-eyed spider, and all the other pollinators that rely on flowers in your garden. That's a hummingbird moth. It definitely stopped me in my tracks. And you might even find a frog. I love frogs. They are my favorite animal. And this was a little froglet that had just metamorphosed that's in this milkweed leaf. And without that milkweed, that frog wouldn't have had that home. And so I'm so grateful for the milkweed. And so here's the thing, like, you don't have to ride your bike 10,000 miles to help the monarch. In fact, riding your bike 10,000 miles won't really help the monarch, but you can plant your garden. So you don't have to bike through the deserts of Mexico. You don't have to navigate New York City. You don't have to brave roadside skunks. By the way, the skunk and I were both fine. All you have to do is plant that garden. And I guarantee you that if you plant your garden, the real adventurers, the monarchs, will come. And I really hope that my book helps kind of open people's eyes up to all the animals that are living in our backyards. And I hope that my book inspires people to go on an adventure. And it doesn't have to be 10,000 miles, like I said. It can be a walk around the block. It can be a walk down a highway ditch looking for native plants. And so I'm just so thrilled that I can offer my story to more people. And this picture here is me launching my bike off of a bunch of the book that I just wrote. And truly, like, everyone that's come out tonight, everyone that's helping spread the word, about my book and the butterfly is helping me go further and farther. And so I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk to all of you tonight. And if you have more questions besides what we get to just in a moment here, my website is beyondabook.org. And yeah, I'm gonna do a little switcheroos again so that I can get on the main screen, and then I'd love to do some questions. So here we go.
We did it. The practice with the screens has been useful. It went.
I know. I'm getting to be a pro at this. Thank you,
Excellent.
butterflies, for helping with that.
So to our audience members, if you do have questions for Sara, now is the time to put them in the chat sidebar or the Q&A. We've already have a couple that we've been collecting. And the first one that I'm going to ask is, you've mentioned helping the Monarchs. For some context, why are the Monarchs in trouble? What happened? When I was a kid, there were butterflies everywhere. And now I might go a week or 3 in the summer without seeing one. What happened?
Yeah, I should have brought that up earlier. I go in all these different directions with what do I want to talk about? What's important? So thanks for thinking of that. The Monarchs have suffered dramatic declines in recent years, and the most simple answer is because of habitat loss. And it's easy to see if you go out into the world that so much of the monarch's habitat has been changed. It's been altered by agriculture, by human developments, all sorts of things. And so every year, I think Monarch Watch estimates that we lose about 6,000 acres of habitat for the monarch. And so that adds up. And if there's less milkweed, then that means there's less monarchs, because that's how the population builds, is by getting lots and lots of eggs on lots and lots of milkweed. So that's what's really so amazing about the monarch, is the solution is that, or the problem is that habitat loss. And for so many species, the only way to help is to make something pristine and not keep people out, but minimize development. But the monarch is so forgiving, and as long as they will go anywhere, as long as you have the native plants and the milkweed. And what a gift.
You just mentioned Monarch Watch, which was also mentioned in our chat sidebar. What is Monarch Watch?
So there's a lot of organizations doing a wonderful work to help take care of the monarch, and Monarch Watch is one of them. They have 2 really influential programs. One is their tagging program. So you can actually buy tags from Monarch Watch, and they have these little unique codes on them, kind of like a license plate. And they're stickers, and you can actually put a sticker on a fall migrating monarch. And you'll record where you put the sticker on, what record information on the monarch, and then you'll release them. And if anyone else on the migratory path catches that monarch and sees it has a sticker, then they can give that data to Monarch Watch. And that's often how we know about the pace of the migration. We know point A to point B. And Monarch Watch has tagged about 2 million monarchs, and 19,000 have been recovered in Mexico. So that gives us an idea. And one of the great things, the coolest things I've learned from the tagging efforts, in my opinion, is that monarchs, it's not like the monarchs in New Hampshire all go to the same colony in Mexico. It's like 80% of all the monarchs captured all over the summer range go to this one colony called El Rosario. It doesn't matter where they're tagged. So like they tagged a bunch of monarchs in one field in Kansas, and they all went to different colonies at the overwintering sites. And we would only know that information thanks to citizen scientists.
Okay, so we have a question from Denise. Sara, did you bike through Portsmouth on New Hampshire on Route 1A to the New Hampshire beaches? She thinks you might have ridden past her house.
I did. I don't, a lot of the names of towns kind of all blur together, but I hit the ocean in Maine, and then I followed the coast down. But I kind of try to avoid big cities, so to avoid Boston, I kind of went all around Boston. But I do remember that it was a nice bridge. I stopped for a look right there, so I should have waved.
Let's see here. When you say that butterflies are flying to Mexico, don't you mean that it may be that butterfly's offspring who finally makes it to Mexico? How long do butterflies live? This is a wonderful talk. During the last 2 years, I have slowly seen my monarchs coming back to my home in Warner, New Hampshire, she says.
Yay. Right. Yeah. Sometimes when I'll be talking and I'll be like, "Oh, I can't do the generational math quite fast enough in my head." But typically what happens is the monarchs that overwinter, they fly to Texas, they lay their eggs and they die. And then those eggs are what we call the first generation. And they'll continue the migration north. And it usually takes about 2 or 3 to 5 generations to make that complete loop. And so it's usually, it really depends on where you are. Since you all are so far north, it's going to be earlier in the year than the folks in Missouri or Texas. But when it's the fall, typically the monarchs that are born will emerge not sexually reproductive. So normally during the summer and in the spring months, the monarchs start mating and laying eggs about day 3. These monarchs won't do that. Instead, they will fly all the way back to Mexico, where they'll overwinter. And they go to the forest in Mexico because it's the perfect, not too cold, not too hot temperature. If they stayed in New Hampshire, they would freeze to death. But they don't want to stay in Mexico because there's not as much milkweed. So they've made this trade-off of this long flight. And they go to Mexico, they hang suspended in those trees. That way they conserve less energy so that when spring happens, they'll start mating, and then they'll head north to Texas, where they will eventually lay their eggs and begin the migration anew.
Okay. Did you see the monarchs wintering in Mexico?
I did. So I went to Mexico in January of 2017, and I visited all 4 of the colonies that are open to the public. There's El Rosario is the biggest one, and when I went there, you have to have a guide, and my guide was this woman named Brianda, and I had a few months to just hang out. So because I got there in January and I wasn't going to leave until March, and so I said, "Hey, I'm like looking for something to do," and she was like, "Oh, do you want to live at my house and teach everybody some English?" And again, it's sort of that same theory of like, since I didn't have a really set schedule, I could say yes. And so I ended up living with Brianda for a few weeks. And then when I returned in November, I stayed with her again, this time for I think about a month or 2. And then the next year I went back, and then the next year I went back. And this is the first winter I haven't gone back, but I'm still in touch with them, and just love that the Monarch connected me not just to the land, but to the people too.
Are the monarchs protected in Mexico?
So the monarchs the monarchs that overwinter are, most of them are in the Monarch Biosphere Butterfly Reserve, which has protection. And it's complicated. It's a little more complicated because like the national parks here, the protected land in the United States, long ago, the government kicked all the people off that land. But in Mexico, people still live on that reserve, and they still depend on lumber, and they still depend on the land to grow their crops. So it's a little bit more of a balance. But luckily, the monarchs bring in new types of jobs and new types of industry. So a lot of my friends are guides, and it's complicated, right? Like Brianda can only be a guide every 3 years, and so there's still like lots of issues with how to make it sustainable and equitable. But it does give a lot of opportunity to the folks so that they can find new ways to make a living off the land besides logging.
How did you prepare to ride that far? Did you do training rides? Some people are saying, I have a hard time riding, even this far. How did you ride thousands of miles?
Well, like I said, the first thing to do is don't think about the whole trip. Think about lunch and be like, oh, if I go 20 miles, I get to have lunch. That's a good starting place. But I didn't do any training. My theory is just start slow and stop when you're tired. And the first few days are going to hurt. And then you're just going to you're going to get used to it. And you're going to be able to go a little farther every day. So what I did more for preparing is to learn about the monarchs and to start making connections. And in fact, my route was very fluid. It was very tentative. And as I would bike, people would hear about my story. And as long as I didn't have to add too many miles, or in some cases I did add a lot of miles, I would kind of change my route as I went. And that was really more the process of preparing, was just getting the word out.
Was this journey consecutive, or did you do it in pieces? You did this all in one go?
I did. I started in March of 2017, and I ended I think the very end of November, November 30th, I believe, which is about a month slower than the rest of the monarchs. So my joke is I'm slower than a monarch butterfly, but faster than the caterpillars. And because the monarchs typically arrive back at the monarch colonies in Mexico around Day of the Dead, around November 2nd. So I was lagging.
So I was going to ask, what can we do to support monarch butterflies? The answer, quite obviously, is grow milkweed,
Yep.
and support natural landscaping instead of this water guzzling non-native grass. Instead, to plant natural landscaping, native plants. Someone's asking, can you give us one or two resources about how we might dip our toes into growing milkweed?
Yeah, I would Google like your local plant nursery, or natural, or local master naturalists, gardeners. Um, that's a tongue tie. Find a local expert, because there's so many different regions, and I could say a few things that are kind of in general, but really, if you can connect to a few people in your area, and I guarantee they're out there, and they'll direct you to the best place to buy seeds or to buy starts. And it's really important you get the right ones, because often the ones that you might buy at like a box store might have pesticides on them that would be really dangerous for the caterpillars. Um, you can start with Monarch Watch too, of course. Monarch Watch is a great resource. I also really love Monarch Joint Ventures website, and Journey North is another good one.
We have a comment in the sidebar here that says land trusts staffing would know a lot too about what is available for local biomes.
Yeah.
So someone asks here, so it takes 3 or 4 monarch generations to make the trip to Mexico, but only 1 generation to return into the US. Why is this?
Right. So the monarchs, their goal is to survive the winter and then find milkweed. And there's not a lot of milkweed between their overwintering grounds in Texas. And so the overwintering generation, they live a lot longer, and their goal really is just survive winter, survive winter. And as soon as they've done that, then they book it back to Texas, because then their goal is create lots of offspring.
And you did mention that the overwintering generation is not sexually reproductive yet. So they haven't put their energy into that yet, have they?
Right. Yeah, they'll start. So in Mexico, and the forest is about 10,000 feet above sea level, and so it's pretty cold most of the winter. And then in about February, it starts warming up, and you'll watch and you'll feel the progress. First, there'll be a few monarchs fluttering about, and then by the end of February, every afternoon is just like a storm of monarchs. And by March, often there'll be the storm of monarchs during the day, and they'll be descending down the mountains looking for water, because it's getting drier and drier. And then at some point, instead of flying back to the colonies to roost at night, they just start heading north. And so they kind of trickle out, and it's really an extraordinary thing to see.
So we have another question on native gardening. How do people decide which species to cater to on their properties? Butterflies, bees, birds, frogs, insects, trees, flowers. There are so many important creatures. Although arguably, if you just chose native plants, it would all sort itself out.
Exactly. And I mentioned this a bit, like the monarch is such a great guide to lead us back into nature, but at the same time, they're also great ambassadors. So often call monarchs gateway bugs, because you'll start with the monarch and you'll get really excited about the monarch, and you'll plant a bunch of plants and milkweed for the monarchs, and then you'll realize, oh my gosh, like I'm helping so much more. And that really is the beautiful thing, is when you help frogs, you're helping monarchs. When you help monarchs, you're helping bees, and everything is connected. And of course, when we're helping any of these creatures, we're also helping ourselves. So whatever animal is your passion, that's the one you should go with, and the others will follow suit.
Okay. We have a comment here. I'm amazed at your courage to take this very long bicycle trip by yourself. Do you have a story about a person you were able to sway over to the importance of what you were doing?
I'm not sure about swaying as much as just calling to attention. And there was a person in let's see, I think it was Arkansas, and he stopped in his car. He stopped me, or he stopped his car up the road, and I knew he wanted to talk. And sometimes it takes a lot of my energy to talk, and sometimes I just want to get where I'm going. But that was not the point. And so I wasn't perfect at this, trust me, but but when I was feeling good and I would just take a deep breath and I'd stop and I'd have these conversations. And just remember every single thing I said, he repeated back with like this sense of awe. So it would be like, "You're going," or he'd be like, "Where are you headed?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm headed to Mexico." He's like, "To Mexico?" And then like, "What? Why?" And it's because I want to call to attention the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly? And that just went on for probably 10 or 15 minutes. And I know that that night, wherever that guy went, he shared that story with whoever he was with, and the monarch became part of the conversation around the dinner table. And that to me was a victory, because that's how this happens. And I can't talk to everyone, but if I can talk to enough people and they can talk to enough people, then the message really can spread.
So I want to ask about the paintings behind you. Who did them? And if you want to explain what they are, we talked about them in our green room.
Yeah, so I started these are watercolor paintings that I did of the monarchs. They're two different ones. This one, I'm riding my bike, so it's an aerial view of me with monarchs, my self-portrait. So that's my helmet there, my water bottle, and my bags on my bike. And I actually started on my trip a few adventures ago. I've done quite a few adventures now, but I would, whenever I'd stay with someone, I'd want to give them a little token. And what do you can't carry that much on a bike. That would be hard to do. But I started carrying watercolor paper and some watercolors, and I would paint, to kind of clear my mind at night when I was camping. And then I would have these watercolor cards to give to people. And so I stayed with 68 families on my trip. I did a lot of watercolor. None were as big as what's behind me here, but what I like about this is that over the course of my trip I got way better. And so I think of all the things that I got better at because I was on this trip with the monarchs. And so I actually have come to see the monarchs as my teachers in so many ways. So I'm certain that because of the monarchs I'm a better artist, and because of the monarchs I'm a better writer, and because of the monarch I'm better at a lot of things. And so part of me being a voice for the monarch is to say thank you for all the gifts they've given me, including being able to paint from time to time.
I do want to mention before we have time for maybe one or two more questions, I do want to mention before we close out this event that if you are interested in local conservation efforts, I do suggest a couple local organizations. The New Hampshire Audubon is doing great work in conservation, and the Five Rivers Conservation Trust is also an excellent local conservation organization, and they are pretty great. They were very excited about this event, and they were sharing and spreading the word. So those are some great ones. Sarah, someone wants to know what led you down the path to become so inspired by monarchs?
The monarchs did. I started this trip because I wanted to go on an adventure, honestly. And before this, I had done a few other long distance bike tours, and I call them adventure or education linked adventures. So the previous one is I canoed with some friends from the source of the Missouri River in, well, one of the sources of the Missouri River on a mountain in Glacier National Park in Montana to the Gulf of Mexico. And along the way, my friends and we talked to kids about the Missouri River and adventure and conservation and science. And before that, I did a trip with my friends our goal was to bike to every state but Hawaii. And the reason I missed Rhode Island is because I broke my ankle. And that's a story for another day. But not doing anything biking, being dumb, really.
Does
But
does that mean that you biked to Alaska?
we did well. I should clarify. We biked to Bellingham, Washington, took a ferry to Alaska, and then we biked back. if we spent the whole time biking there and back, it would have eaten up all of our winter or summer months to cover the north. So we biked one direction, but during that we did presentations too to kids, and I fell in love with sharing my adventure, and I feel really privileged and really lucky to be able to do these trips. And so if I can kind of support other people and get them excited, well, that feels like something I need to do. And I've been blabbering on. I don't even remember what the question was, but there you have it.
The question was what inspired you to spend so much time about monarchs, and they're so beautiful. I don't know anybody who sees a monarch butterfly and just goes, I mean, they're
exactly
just, they're like neon, notice me's. So.
Exactly. And I guess I would just add to that answer then, now that thank you for refreshing my memory, is that I started off more on the adventure side of wanting to do an adventure that I could link to schools, because monarchs are already in schools. And as I pedaled with them, I learned so much more, and I got more and more invested. And I really do feel this bond by meeting all the people taking care of the monarchs, and like literally feeling what it's like to be a traveler with monarchs. That every day I fell in love with them more and more, and the rest is history.
So where is home base? Where do you ride out of?
Well, I'm from out just outside of Kansas City in Kansas, and I think my trip, to get to Mexico to start my trip, I took a ridiculously long bus ride. I think it was 3 days bus ride from Kansas City to Michoacan. I am pretty transient. Thanks to COVID, I've spent the last year in California. It's the longest I've lived anywhere in the same spot for probably almost 20 years. So it's been a new adventure in itself. And we talked about hobbies at the beginning of the year. I have really been monarchs were kind of my inspiration for my bike tour. This year, my inspiration has really been trees, and I've just really fallen in love with the trees, and they're kind of teaching me how to stick in one spot and just be okay with an adventure where you don't go anywhere.
Well, thank you so much for sticking in one spot for an hour with us. Sara Dykman is the author of Bicycling with Butterflies, which is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are available for in-store browsing, curbside pickup, and online ordering. And Sara was very generous to send us signed book plates and art prints for your orders from Gibson's. So thank you once more for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for everyone for coming out and for buying the book and spreading the word. And yeah, it means a lot to me.
Keep flying, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night. Thanks.